Somewhere along the wet-breathing bayous of southern Louisiana, in the brutal summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds. Not of yellow fever, not of consumption. Each man's throat was opened with surgical precision while he slept, and each was found at dawn with a face fixed between ecstasy and terror. All 11 belonged to the inner circle of the Knights of the White Camellia, the most feared Ku Klux chapter in St. Martin Parish. On paper, their deaths were unrelated incidents, scattered across 4 parishes. Reports contradicted witnesses, evidence was misfiled or ignored, and within 6 months a parish judge sealed everything. But in the cramped rooms of the colored quarters, in the back halls of freedmen's churches, another story stirred and grew, never written down, never spoken when white ears might hear. Tonight that story begins. It does not begin in 1872. It begins 4 years earlier, in the ash-glow aftermath of a war that was supposed to be over. In 1868, St. Martin Parish was a wound that would not close. Sugar and cotton mansions slumped like rotten teeth against a merciless sky. Fields sank back into swamp. Some manor houses were occupied by federal troops. Others were collapsing under their own pride. The parish seat, Breaux Bridge, was a cluster of weather-beaten buildings around a courthouse that had traded flags 3 times in 7 years. The old planter class felt the ground tilt under them. Nearly 4,000 formerly enslaved people now walked openly where they had once been forbidden to look up. Some owned property. They voted, under the wary protection of soldiers and the Freedmen's Bureau. They testified in court. To many white residents it felt like an inversion of nature itself, an ending of the world they understood. The Knights of the White Camellia rose from the remains of militia clubs and veterans' lodges. They fancied themselves refined. No hoods, no burning crosses. Lawyers, merchants, ex-officers, planters. They controlled the courthouse, the sheriff's office, the parish council. They didn't need spectacle. They had power. Their methods were surgical. A freedman who spoke too boldly might find his crop scorched, his mule hamstrung, his credit gone dry overnight. A colored man who registered to vote might receive a midnight visit from well-dressed gentlemen who advised him very reasonably to reconsider. Violence was for the stubborn, and even then it was careful, designed to terrorize without drawing federal intervention. Every Thursday, the Knights Inner Circle, 11 men, met in a back room of the Breaux Bridge Hotel, a 3-story building on Main Street, owned by a founding member, Harold Jessup. There, verdicts were decided without juries, who needed reminding, who should move along, who required stronger persuasion. Into this powder keg, on a Tuesday in late April, stepped a woman calling herself Celeste Dufresne. She arrived from New Orleans with a single trunk and a black silk parasol. She could have been 30. Her face held a quality that slipped the usual clockwork of age. Skin the color of café au lait, poised between categories that Louisiana pretended were simple. She wore mourning clothes cut with money and precision, the sort of garments that spoke of a skilled hand and expensive fabric. She rented a room at Jessup's hotel, paying a month in advance in gold coins counted one by one. Her French was flawless. Her English bore a Parisian lilt that made people listen. She was, she said, the widow of a French merchant, claimed by the yellow fever the previous summer. She hoped to buy a small place, land enough to live quietly, far from the city's chaos. It was a plausible story. New Orleans had indeed been ravaged. French merchants were everywhere in Louisiana. Creole widows often sought refuge in smaller towns, and Celeste carried herself with a dignity that discouraged probing questions. She attended Mass at St. Bernard's, sitting in the pews where respectable Creole families sat. She dined alone in the hotel, reading thin French novels or writing letters in a neat, controlled hand. In the afternoons she walked, parasol tilted, offering polite nods, inviting no conversation. Within 2 weeks, every man on the Knights' Council had taken notice. It began innocently. Thomas Broussard, heir to 1,500 struggling acres east of town, found her examining a bolt of fabric outside the general store. He offered help. He knew the merchant could ensure a fair price. She smiled, grateful, amused, as though his chivalry was charming but unnecessary. They talked 10 minutes. She mentioned trouble finding property, her unfamiliarity with the area, her reliance on the kindness of strangers in this difficult passage of mourning. Broussard thought about her all day. It wasn't just beauty, though she had that. It was a kind of attentive focus, a way of looking that made a man feel singular. When she touched his sleeve in thanks, it felt like a current. He began drifting through the hotel lobby at the hours she passed, offering to show parcels of land. She accepted graciously, always with propriety, never past sunset, always with others somewhere nearby. He told his wife it was business, Christian assistance to a respectable widow. But candlelight on the curve of Celeste's neck wouldn't leave him. The faint lavender that clung to her dresses haunted his clothes after he returned home. The others noticed his distraction and staged their own entrances. Antoine Lair, the lawyer who had made federal courtrooms safe for Klansmen, offered legal counsel. Dr. Raymond Heber, parish coroner, worried aloud about her health and urged a consultation. Eugene Fontenot, the dry goods baron, extended generous credit for any household item a future home might require. Jessup Thibodeau, the editor, Judge Vincent Thieu, Sheriff Claude Darrow, banker Philippe Rousseau, planters William Duplantis and Charles Arsenault, all found polite pretexts. Celeste accepted with the same reserved grace, never encouraging, yet leaving each man feeling uniquely understood. They told themselves it was chivalry. They told themselves their wives were provincial, not to blame for the comparison. They told themselves nothing improper had happened. And none of them noticed that Celeste hadn't bought a single acre. None wondered why a grieving widow would choose a parish bristling with racial war. None questioned why she never wept, never spoke of her husband beyond polite vagueness. They did not see her after midnight, seated at a small desk in room 7, opening a leather-bound journal and recording with a clerk's precision where each man lived, who guarded his home, whether his wife slept lightly, whether a pistol lay within reach, what he feared, what he craved, what he had done, because Celeste Dufresne, if that was her name, had not come to buy property. She had come for a purpose that required patience, planning, and every weapon a woman might wield in a hostile world. She had come to kill 11 men. The first death arrived on July 19th. During a heat wave people would talk about for decades, Thomas Broussard's wife found him at dawn, laid out on their bed with his throat opened from ear to ear, the cut so deep it nearly kissed the spine. The sheets, the mattress, the floor soaked, yet his face looked peaceful, eyes closed, hands resting as if sleep had simply continued past morning. The household rushed in. Among them was Esther, once a slave, now a paid servant, who had kept that house before the war and after. Years later, in testimony that never reached an official page, Esther would recall what the white authorities would not see. 2 empty wine glasses on the bedside table, the room scented with lavender, and something sweeter, more human. The bedclothes unsettled by the kind of activity respectable people didn't discuss, but every woman recognized. Mrs. Broussard had slept in an adjoining room. Insomnia, she said, yet claimed to have heard nothing. Sheriff Darrow arrived with Dr. Hebert. The narrative assembled itself like furniture they'd put together before. An intruder, likely a freedman with a grievance, had crept in and killed a sleeping man. Nothing stolen, clearly personal. Perhaps retaliation for the reminders the knights had been delivering. Later, while scrubbing blood and burning sheets at the mistress's order, Esther found a single long hair caught in the floorboards, too fine and dark to be Mrs. Broussard's, and other stains on the linen no man on the parish council would admit to understanding. She said nothing. In the quarters, a different story took shape. They spoke softly of the beautiful widow who had captured so many prominent eyes, of Broussard's afternoons at the hotel, of private dinners and property drives that went nowhere, of a man known for cruelty to freedmen, found with a neat, impossible wound, days after dining with the widow from New Orleans. The funeral drew the whole parish. The knights stood together by the grave, their faces carved in granite. They understood what this meant, a message, a declaration. They blamed federal sympathizers, Negro agitators. They whispered responses, targets, escalations. None of them noticed the veiled woman standing at a distance, head bowed. None saw the small, satisfied curve of her mouth when she thought no one watched, and none of them guessed that in exactly 3 weeks the bell would toll again. By the time the grave dirt settled over Thomas Broussard, the story had 2 faces. The official one, inked by Sheriff Darrow and printed by Thibodeau's paper, spoke of a prowler, a ruffian, perhaps one of those uppity freedmen who mistook new rights for license. The other face moved mouth to mouth through the quarters. A rumor with a heartbeat. A lavender-scented visitor had slipped past Locks and Pride, and a man who loved the lash had died smiling in his sleep. For 2 weeks, Bro Bridge walked on eggshells. The Knights pretended their Thursday meetings were unchanged. Same back room at Jessop's Hotel, same glasses, same cigars, but their precision frayed. They had always spoken in clipped euphemisms, reminders, persuasion, encouragement to relocate. Now their sentences trailed off, and their eyes wandered to the door. They took turns being brave for one another, as if courage could be loaned across the table. Celeste Dufresne's life remained a model of decorum. Mass on Sunday, a nod to the priest. A solitary table in the dining room with a slim French novel set beside her plate. Afternoon walks with that black silk parasol, painting a small shadow on the dust. She inquired about property, of course, and gentlemen who had never lifted a finger to help their own wives found the time to show her parcels they would never sell her. She listened with perfect patience. She did not haggle or flirt in public. She was what every man wanted for himself alone, and no man could claim in the open. Polished, attentive, impossible to grasp. On the first Thursday after the funeral, their meeting sounded different in Jessop's back room. When a chair scraped, heads snapped. When a floorboard creaked, hands went to pocket pistols. They found comfort where they always had, in the fiction of control. "She'll buy something soon," Jessop said, as though property could anchor a ghost. "She?" Judge Théot corrected mildly, the skin around his eyes grey with sleeplessness. "We are speaking of an unknown assailant." Antoine Lair smiled that lawyer's smile, the one that promised cover without light. "Unknown to whom, Judge?" They left more quickly than usual, each to his fortress of habit. Celeste, in her room above the lobby, drew down the shutters, lit a single lamp, and opened the leather journal. She wrote in the same neat, tight hand she used for her letters, but the entries were not letters. They were maps of men: Broussard, heavy sleeper, pistol in drawer, drinks claret, wife in adjacent room, under that a new section, others, routes, guards, schedules, sins. 3 weeks after Broussard's death, almost to the hour, Antoine Lair failed to unlock his office door at dawn. His clerk fetched the sheriff, who fetched the coroner, who fetched the key. They found him in his narrow bachelor's quarters above the law office, the bed linen blooming red like a magnolia gone wrong. His throat had been opened with the same cold skill, no ragged edges, no hesitation. His face bore that same impossible tranquility. There were the 2 clean glasses on the table. There was the faint lavender, threaded with a human sweetness no man would name. There was again the absence of struggle, and there was the clerk's strangled whisper, when he saw the marks on the sheets, the pattern of bodies in motion written into creases and stains. Sheriff Darrow swallowed hard and told the clerk to go fetch a mop. "Another intruder," the coroner murmured, eyes sliding to Darrow's. "Another intruder," the sheriff said aloud for the clerk to hear. Then quieter, "Or the same one." The official narrative faltered. 2 nights, identical deaths 3 weeks apart. Coincidence could no longer carry the weight. Thibodeau's paper printed the word fiend and then, the next day, demon. Privately, he drank and wept in his office. Plotter soaked, because even a man who shapes words knows when words are failing. In the quarters, the rumor shed its shyness and took on a name: Lave Noire, the Black Widow. Some said the name with awe, some with raw nerves, others with the tremor of those who had learned that retribution can splash on the innocent. There were whispered arguments. "You'll bring the lash back to all of us. You'll set the whole parish burning." And there were murmured prayers that did not ask for mercy, so much as for a steadiness of hand. The Knights met in emergency session the following Monday, abandoning the comfort of their Thursday ritual. The back room felt smaller, the ceiling lower, the door too far. Judge Théot opened the gathering with the thin dignity of a man whose robe cannot protect his flesh. "Gentlemen," he said, "we must consider a possibility we have not wanted to name. Both victims appear to have entertained company. Both died without struggle. We are not dealing with some prowling Negro with a field knife. We are dealing with someone admitted to private rooms. Someone trusted. A woman," Dr. Hebert said, barely more than breath. No one argued. The truth sat beaded with sweat on their foreheads. Sheriff Darrow catalogued the obvious measures. Guards hired, locks changed. Routines varied. Family sent to cousins in other parishes, pistols within reach and lamps left burning till dawn. He spoke like a man checking boxes he knew wouldn't hold. "What about the widow?" Thibodeau blurted, then flinched as if he'd struck himself. "Madame Dufresne, what about her?" Jessup asked too quickly. "She appeared a week before Browsard began his property drives," the editor said. "She has had private meetings with half the men in this room. She is of ambiguous origin, speaks French like a belle, and owns nothing she claims to be buying." "That is enough," Judge Teo snapped. "We will not slander a respectable lady without evidence." Respectable lady. The phrase turned to sand in their mouths. Every man in the room had been alone with her, had made some small promise, offered some small gift, confessed some small grief. Investigating her would mean investigating themselves, and beneath the fear flowed something worse: fascination. Even now, even with two bodies laid out in their minds, several of them could not push back the memory of her hand on a sleeve, the angle of her face under a veil, that attentive gaze that made a man feel less like a relic of a dying order. "We proceed discreetly," Sheriff Darrow said at last, voice firming around a plan because plans impress the frightened. "Judge, make inquiries to New Orleans, records of a Dufresne death during the fever, a residence, a boarding house ledger. I will question the hotel staff and merchants. Doctor, you will instruct your deputies." He meant the coroner's attendants. They were not policemen, but he needed the word. "To observe without gossip. Jessup, you will keep the lady comfortable and unalarmed." Jessup nodded, throat working. They adjourned early. The men walked home by side streets, the way criminals do when they fear a watchman. Celeste watched them go from behind the parlor lace, then climbed to room 7 and, sitting very straight, wrote another page in the leather book. That evening, Darrow began his circuit of questions. A shopkeeper remembered the precise, careful way Celeste's gloved fingers examined fabric. The priest remembered a woman who knelt without tremor. The housemaid Rachel, when asked privately and promised, if not protection, at least discretion, spoke of a room that held no memories, no photographs, no letters, no relics of a dead husband. Only neatness, lavender, and a locked trunk. Twice, Rachel said, she had seen Celeste return after midnight by the side door, moving like a shadow, carrying a leather case that looked, if a woman were allowed to guess, like something a doctor carries, why would a widow need such a thing? Darrow asked, though his mind already supplied the answer. Why would a sheriff ask a colored girl what a lady keeps in her hand? Rachel replied softly and kept her eyes on her shoes. Judge Teo's telegrams returned answers like missing teeth. No merchant named Dufresne had died in the New Orleans epidemic. No death certificate matched the name she gave. The Rue Burgundy boarding house she listed as residence had no memory of a Madame Dufresne. It was as if she had grown out of swamp mist, fully formed, with only a wardrobe and a grammar book to prove she was real. The knights increased their precautions. Those with wives sent them away with strong words about business. Those alone paid for former Confederate pickets to sleep under their eaves. They varied their routes and timed their steps. They sat with pistols laid on dressing tables like paperweights. Lamps ate oil all night, and they waited for the third week to turn because some part of them, some illiterate animal part, recognized a rhythm. In the quarters, the rhythm had a different beat. Women gathered for prayer meetings that became planning sessions over hymns. Men repaired this and that, moving tools that did not always return to the same shed. Teenagers carried notes in their shoes. Isaiah, the carpenter deacon with the sad eyes, told anyone who asked that he was too old to keep secrets, and then kept them anyway. Justice is heavy, he told a young man who offered to sit outside Jessup's with a knife. You don't lift a church bell with one hand. On the night before the third week would ripen, Celeste, if that name still belonged to her, wound her hair tight and stood before the small mirror in room 7. For a moment she watched the woman who watched the men. Her face held that out-of-time quality again, neither young nor old, just etched by purpose. She pressed a folded photograph to her chest, an image of a younger woman taken in lighter days, and slid it back into the bag. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the hotel breathe, counting her own pulse, feeling the clock draw its circle closed. At dawn on August 27th, a scream rose from the narrow street behind the coroner's surgery. But that belongs to the next telling. For now, on the cusp between repetition and escalation, the parish hung suspended, half convinced a fortress of lamps and pistols could hold back a shadow, half certain that the shadow already lived inside their walls. 2 men were dead. 9 remained, and the story, having taken its second breath, was learning to run. The 3rd week ripened like fruit left too long on a windowsill. At dawn on August 27th, the coroner's boy found his master face down on the examination table, throat opened with the same unhesitating stroke that had ended Broussard and Lair. The room smelled of alcohol and lavender, and beside the lamp sat 2 rinsed wineglasses. Pinned to Dr. Raymond Hebbert's waistcoat with a surgical pin was a square of paper, neat as a label on a specimen jar. "Remember Baton Rouge." Sheriff Darrow read it twice, then folded it into his pocket, like something that could burn through cloth. The official story, prowler, ruffian, intruder, collapsed under the weight of a handwriting that looked like a schoolmistress had taught it. This was no random blade. This was accounting. The knights gathered that evening, stripped of their Thursday bravado. Thibodeau's fingers shook too hard to strike a match. Jessup poured whiskey he could not swallow. Judge Théot spoke first because someone had to. In March of '68, he said, Hebert traveled to Baton Rouge to testify in a federal inquiry. A freedwoman, Sarah Boudreau, accused white men, some from our parish, of attacking her husband and burning their home. Hebert swore her husband died of prior ailments. Théot's voice thinned. It was a lie that kept men free. 3 months later, he reminded them, Sarah Boudreau was found in a New Orleans rooming house with her own throat cut. "Robbery," said the papers. "Nothing taken," said those who bothered to look. "So," Jessup rasped, "our visitor knows the old cases." "She knows our hands." "Not our hands," Thibodeau said too quickly. "Some hands." "Enough hands," Darrow replied. Judge Théot had been reading more than telegrams. He spread clippings and docket notes like cards. Sarah had a daughter, 12 then. After the mother's murder, the girl disappears. No burial, no apprenticeship, no boarding house ledger. She simply vanishes. 4 years ago, Jessup said. "So she'd be older than the widow appears," the judge admitted. "Unless the widow's age is a costume, same as her name. Unless the accent, the mourning, the coin, all of it are means, not facts." The thought none of them wanted arrived anyway. If Celeste was Sarah Boudreau's child, then every man who had courted her attention, however politely, however privately, had crossed a line the law called unthinkable when it suited white men to think so. The scandal alone would finish them. "We arrest her tonight," Darrow said, grabbing the only rope within reach. "No warrants." "No gossip. Quiet. On what charge?" Théot asked, the lawyer backing him, refusing to die. "On the charge that we don't live to see a 4th note," Thibodeau snapped, eyes wild. "We have handled worse without paper." The room heard what he meant. Murder without trial. The old remedy for inconvenient people. They had done it to men who could not vote. Now they would do it to a woman who would not be afraid. They voted. 9 hands, 9 shadows against lamplight. They would resolve the matter before another sunrise. No one noticed the serving girl, Marie, pausing outside the thin door as she stacked glasses. No one saw her slip down the back stairs, then down the darker streets to the quarters where people had learned to run messages like "blood runs heat." Before midnight, a single line reached room 7, written on brown paper the color of church benches. "They mean to take you tonight." Celeste, if that name was still useful, smiled without warmth. She closed the leather journal, blew out her lamp, and began to pack. By morning, she would be gone from the hotel, 1 trunk, a bill settled, a polite farewell to the clerk. By evening, the steamboat south would list a veiled widow on its manifest, but the woman beneath that veil would not be Celeste. And the woman who had learned to cut clean would not be anywhere a knight expected her to be. For now, the only thing that mattered was the note on a dead man's chest and the truth it carried. This was no fiend's whim. This was a ledger being balanced line by careful line. By noon, the hotel ledger showed a tidy exit. Madame Celeste Dufresne, balance paid in gold, trunk to the dock, onward to New Orleans. Jessup signed the receipt himself, relieved by the elegance of an ending that asked no questions. That evening, a steamboat's manifest noted a veiled widow in mourning, quiet as luggage. But the woman beneath that veil was Charlotte, a freedwoman with a similar carriage and a steadier nerve than anyone guessed. The real hunter never touched the gangplank. She moved 2 streets over, into the quarters behind the Freedmen's Church, where doors opened without knocking and plans could be spoken under the cover of hymns. The knights congratulated themselves for driving trouble out. Trouble had simply changed addresses. 2 weeks later, before dawn rinsed the stars, Eugene Fontenot was found slumped in his wagon on the road between his store and his home, reins looped loose around a patient horse. Same clean gash, same impossible calm. On his chest, a square of paper pinned like a price tag. Remember the Fontenot store fire? Everyone remembered. In '69, 3 freedmen opened a rival shop with fair credit. A week later, their building lit the night like judgment. Families fled. No inquiry worth the name. The road where Eugene died was too narrow for a mob. It held just enough space for 2 bodies to sit shoulder to shoulder until one of them didn't need shoulders anymore. Sheriff Dero rode the route twice that day, as if distance could confess. He posted men, promised rewards, printed warnings. At night he slept in his office with a pistol on his chest, because a man who cannot find the door the wolf used starts sleeping behind every door he owns. 2 weeks turned again like a key, and Philippe Rousseau, the banker, failed to greet his clerks. They found him at his ledger, neck opened over a column of figures that bloomed red into the margins. The note was neat, almost tender. Remember the foreclosure? It named a freedman farmer, a year a violation of the bank's own policy, and the steep fall from debt to destitution that followed. The law had called it business. The note called it by its other name. Now even the white town, which had practiced not seeing as a civic virtue, began to look over its shoulder. Ladies drew curtains before full dark. Men walked in pairs. Doors grew new bolts like trees grow rings. Thibodeau's paper flailed. Outrage, then anarchy, then finally, a headline that sounded like a prayer spoken through teeth. Authorities will prevail. His ink stank of whiskey and fear. The federal government, slow to stir and slower to move, sent a U.S. Marshal from Baton Rouge, Holbrook, a narrow man with a soldier's posture and the tired eyes of one who has counted too many graves. He listened first, which made people talk. He toured scenes, touched lintels, timed the steps between door and bed and desk. He interviewed the surviving knights, found them armed, hollow, and suddenly very interested in the niceties of due process. He spoke alone and at length with hotel servants, boarders, day laborers, washerwomen. Every story he heard from the quarters carried the same absence. No one saw a face, or if they did, they had forgotten it on purpose. Yet the details matched too well to be invention. The lavender, the twin glasses, the way locks failed without breaking. A name rode the whispers, Lavenoir, not proof but something more durable, consensus. At the church, Holbrook found Isaiah, a deacon with carpenter's hands and an old wound in his gaze. They sat in a pew long after the candles guttered. "You're hunting one woman," Isaiah said at last. "One knife. That ain't how heavy things move." Holbrook stared at the sawed edge of his own question. "How do they move, then?" "Like a team under a yoke," Isaiah said. "You put enough shoulders to it, even a courthouse shifts. Maybe stop looking for one set of footprints and mind how the road itself keeps changing under you." It wasn't a confession. It was a map of what the law couldn't chart. The marshal could haul men in on suspicion and trigger the very blaze he'd been sent to prevent. He could recommend troops and admit that civilian government in St. Martin Parish was a costume. Or he could file the narrowest truth a wide world would accept. A transient killer, likely calling herself Celeste Dufresne, fled the jurisdiction. Warrant recommended. Locals advised to secure themselves. Holbrook chose ink that would let the powder keg sleep a little longer. He rode back to Baton Rouge under a sky that promised rain and kept it. By then the parish understood what the knights had refused to learn. The calendar was a metronome, not a comfort. Every 14 days the air thinned and lamps burned lower. Guards multiplied, wives vanished to cousins, pistols learned the shape of their owners' palms. And still a door somewhere sighed. Still a note somewhere found its pin. 5 dead, 6 breathing like men who had swallowed glass. And the ledger, line by patient line, was nowhere near closed. Sheriff Darrow found the pattern by accident. Ink circles on a calendar, grief turned to arithmetic. Broussard to Lair, 14 days. Lair to Hebert, 14. Hebert to Fontenot, Fontenot to Rousseau. Each exactly 2 weeks, as if a clock had been set inside the parish, and no one could hear it but the dead. He took the calendar to the survivors, Jessup, Thibodeau, Judge Théot, and spread it on the jailhouse table like a map of a war they were losing. "If it holds," he said, tapping the squares, "the next strike lands October 1st. After that, October 15th. And then, he didn't finish. The room already felt crowded with future corpses. They chose stone over timber, walls over windows. On September 30th, the 4 men hauled provisions and cots into the parish courthouse, a squat fortress with thick brick and iron-banded doors. 8 armed guards took posts at entries and along the perimeter. Lamps burned in every corridor. Pistols lay where law books once sat. Judge Teo walked the halls with a builder's eye, naming strengths like blessings, limited approaches, heavy shutters, a basement that breathed only through a narrow coal chute no gentleman had ever used. "Here," Darrow said, planting himself beneath the high windows of the main courtroom. "We keep the 4 of us together. We rotate the watch. We don't sleep without 2 men standing." His voice had the brittle confidence of a bridge tested by flood. Outside, Bro Bridge held its breath. Curtains closed early. Porches went dark. In the quarters behind the Freedmen's Church, the air moved differently. Women gathered with hymnals that hid lists. Men fetched tools and canvas under the talk. Of repairs, boys and girls ran messages pressed into their palms like prayers. Isaiah the deacon stood beneath the church rafters, hearing the congregation sing the old sorrow up into the beams and down again into resolve. That night, in a small house behind the church, the hunter spread a town map and traced lines with a clean finger. "They'll be in the courthouse," she said. No veil now, no borrowed accent. "They think walls will save them." Marie, the serving girl who had heard more through thin doors than any man ever confessed in open court, leaned forward. "Then we meet them where they hide." "We meet them where they never look," the hunter answered. She tapped a penciled mark along the street-facing wall. In 67 they added a coal chute. Narrow, grated, rarely used. It opens to the basement. "Unlatched bolts if a friend loosens them." Her eyes met Isaiah's. "We have friends." Isaiah nodded once. "We've already got hands for the street, not to storm, to watch, to witness, to sing. If they try to make you vanish, the whole parish will know before the candles go cold." "Good," she said. "Tonight isn't about noise, it's about truth set in front of the men who choked it. It's about telling them before the blade why." She packed her small bag, knife wrapped in oiled cloth, 4 folded notes, already written, a bottle and cloth that smelled like hospitals, and the creased photograph of a woman smiling at a camera that had caught her on a better day. She pressed the photo to her sternum, not for luck but for alignment, then slid it back. Darrow's clock reached midnight. Inside the courthouse, nerves settled into routine. Jessup drank from a silver flask and called it courage. Thibodeau mopped sweat with newsprint and left headlines on his skin. Teot shuffled papers as if docket order could impose moral order. Darrow stared out into the dark square, watching for a mob that did not come. In the quarters, the mob that might have been a mob began to sing instead, low and steady, hymns with spines of iron. Lanterns pricked the dark like stars that had chosen to live closer to earth. No one moved on the courthouse steps. No one pushed a door. They just stayed, breathing, watching, turning the building from a refuge into a stage. At the stroke between September 30th and October 1st, a narrow grate lifted on oiled bolts with the small sound of a hinge that had remembered mercy. A figure slid down into the courthouse basement, coal dust at her palms, breath held until the building's own breath matched hers. She found the stair, the shadowed run between storage crates and old minutes of meetings that had never named the right crimes. She counted boards that squeaked and avoided them. She moved along the inside of walls the knights had measured only from the outside. In the main courtroom, 4 men sat under lamplight and imagined themselves safe because their backs were to brick, not realizing the danger had always been the door they didn't know existed. Darrow checked his watch. Jessup raised the flask. Thibodeau rubbed his eyes. Teo signed something that would not save him. And behind a clerk's door that had been left carelessly on the latch, a hand settled on a knife hilt that had learned the parish's rhythm, 14 days between cuts, a ledger written in blood because ink had failed. Outside, the hymn rose 1 note higher, then steadied, not an alarm, not a charge, only the sound of witnesses preparing to remember exactly what happened next. The courthouse breathed like a tired animal. Lamps hissing, floorboards settling, guards shifting their weight the way men do when fear grows heavy. Past the clerk's door, She waited in a darkness that knew her by now. One slow breath for steadiness, one quiet turn of the latch. She stepped into the courtroom. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then 4 faces swung toward her as if pulled by the same wire. Jessup's gone grey around the mouth. Thibodeau's eyes raw. Judge Théot with a pen frozen mid-stroke. Sheriff Darrow already half-turned toward the windows, as if the danger must be out there. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, voice low and even. "So you've been expecting me, and still you forgot a door." 2 guards by the main entrance jerked their rifles up. The third reached for a whistle and then didn't. Something about the calm in her posture, the absence of haste, the way the room seemed to have been waiting for this moment all along. "Madame Dufresne," Darrow managed, anger and relief braided together. "Or do you prefer another name?" "My name," she said, "is Josephine Boudreau, daughter of Sarah and Marcus Boudreau. You murdered my mother's hope in Baton Rouge and her body in New Orleans. I am here to collect what is owed." The words landed like dates stamped in a ledger. No shouting, no tremor. The kind of truth a court should have held and never did. "Arrest her," Judge Théot said, but the order lacked bones. The guards glanced at the windows. Outside, a congregation of lanterns flickered in the square. Voices had risen in a steady hymn, witnesses hemming the courthouse with memory, so it could not lose its place. "You can try," Josephine told them, "and you can kill me. But every person outside knows where I am and why. If I don't walk out of here alive, you won't walk out at all, by law or by fire. I would rather the law." "I asked it first." She set a small bundle on the clerk's table, 4 folded slips of paper, each pinned and labeled in that neat schoolroom hand. She did not touch the knife. "Listen," she said, and began to read, not the notes but the parish itself. She named men beaten behind sheds and women chased from homes. She named fields burned, mules hamstrung, ballots stolen, testimonies broken under threat. She named dates the knights had forgotten, and places they had pretended were nowhere. She spoke of Eugene Fontenot's order that lit a competitor's store, of Philippe Rousseau's foreclosure that turned a farmer into a beggar, of Antoine Laire's practiced lies, of Hebert's oath in Baton Rouge that killed a case and then a woman. Each account crisp as a docket, human as breath. Thibodeau folded in on himself, elbows on knees, the editor undone by an unprintable truth. Jessup stared at the silver flask in his hand, as if it had betrayed him. Darrow stood very still, weighing outcomes like a scalesmith who knows every weight is wrong. Judge Théot pinched the bridge of his nose and looked for the first time in years like a man and not a robe. "You're confessing to 7 murders," Théot said at last, clinging to the remains of a structure he understood. "The guards are witnesses. This ends with a trial and a rope." "Then give me the trial," Josephine replied. "Put me on the stand. Let me swear before God and man. Let me call the people you silenced. Let me list every name I just spoke, and watch which northern papers come sniffing. If you believe in your law, let it work, now at last." Silence stretched. Outside, the hymn held firm. Not a threat, not a cheer. Just a line drawn in sound that said, "We are here. We will remember." "What do you want?" Darrow asked, the question of a man who had run out of orders. "Justice," she said. "Since your law won't give it, I'll settle for balance. 7 of you are gone. 4 remain. You have 2 choices. Walk into Baton Rouge at dawn and confess everything, or refuse and take your chances with me. Understand, there is no third road where this is forgotten." "You're bluffing," Jessup whispered, but his voice knew better. Across the table, something in Judge Théot unraveled with a soft, exhausted sound. He set down his pen and looked up at the woman who had come through the door he'd never cared to know. "We did this," he said, "no grandeur, no defense. We made a world where law obeyed us, instead of the other way around. It was always going to come back." He reached for a clean sheet of paper. His hand shook once, then steadied. "If it is to be written, I will write it." Thibodeau stared. "Judge, I will not confess to what I did not do," Théot said, "but I will record what we did, each of us by name." He looked at Josephine. "You will hold it, not the courts. Not the governor, you." Darrow's jaw worked. He could draw, shoot, try to force a tale back into silence and set the square ablaze. Or he could let a different kind of order settle over the room. "Stand down," he told the guards. The words tore out of him like cloth from a nail. No one fires. No one moves. Josephine watched the decision arrive the way rain arrives, first in the air, then on the skin. She slid one of the folded slips across the table to Jessup, then one to Thibodeau, then to Darrow, last to Théo, each pin pricking each man's palm as if to prove he still bled. "Read them," she said. "Know them. If you run, if you harm another, if you resume, these go to every church, every camp, every paper that still remembers what a spine is." Outside, the hymn swelled and steadied again, the square holding its breath with discipline born of long practice. Inside, pens scratched, lanterns gutted and were trimmed, and the courthouse, built to name lesser crimes, finally began to hold the weight of greater ones. Dawn was not far. The door she had used would be there when she needed it. But first the pages had to fill, names where there had been euphemisms, acts where there had been incidents, sentences where there had been silence. A woman stood in a room where men had decided fates, and without raising her voice changed what the room was for. Dawn pressed a grey thumbprint on the courthouse windows. Inside, the room of verdicts had become a room of names. Judge Teot wrote in a careful courthouse hand, no flourishes, no euphemisms, each night, each act, each date, each victim. Where their minutes once said persuasion or reminder, the page now read arson, assault, murder. Where they had once said men unknown, the list spelled them out letter by letter. Thibodeau signed with a blot that bled like an admission. Jessup with a hand that shook but did not stop. Sheriff Darrow last, jaw locked, eyes hard, the line of his name as straight as a rifle barrel. Witnesses, 2 guards, white-faced and silent. Below the final signature, Théo wrote the sentence no court had managed to set. "We did these things." Josephine folded the confession once, then again, and slid it into the leather bag that had carried her tools and her mother's photograph. The paper didn't look heavy, but the room leaned toward it as if gravity had shifted. "The terms," Darrow said, "because a lawman can't help pretending he still has a law to speak with." The hymn outside steadied him like a metronome. "Say them." "You will stop," Josephine answered. "No more night rides, no more burnings, no more threats dressed as neighborly visits. If you resume," this on she tapped the bag, "goes where walls cannot keep it, pulpits, camps, papers, Baton Rouge." "And you?" Théo asked, voice scraped down to the truth. "What becomes of you?" "I leave Louisiana," she said. "I become no one you can summon. If you keep your hands off the people you tormented, you will never see me again. If you don't, you will not have to look hard. It was not justice. It was a truce signed with fear and paper, because the law had failed too long to be trusted. But it was also something harder to erase than a verdict. Acknowledgement." Darrow glanced at the guards. "Stand aside," he said. They moved from the doors as if unlearning a stance. Josephine gathered the 4-pinned slips, the private bills each man would carry in his palm whenever he reached for sleep. She lifted the clerk's latch and retraced the narrow path through which she'd entered, past ledgers, past benches worn smooth by other people's pleas, down into the basement, where old minutes gathered dust. She climbed the coal chute's iron rungs and slid the grate aside. Outside, the hymn parted like a curtain. Lantern light shook on faces that had kept the square all night. Women with shawls tight, men with hats in their hands, children up past fear. No one cheered. They made a corridor and she walked it. On the steps behind her, the 4 remaining knights did not appear. The crowd did not goad them out. Witnessing was the point, not spectacle. Isaiah stepped from the edge of the lanterns and fell in beside Josephine for 3 paces. No farther. "Is it done?" he asked. "It is written," she said. "That's more than most ever get." At the edge of the square she paused and turned, not to the courthouse, but to the people whose singing had held the night together. She lifted a hand once, brief and plain, then vanished into the narrow streets where morning cooks on low fires. By noon, the hotel on Main Street had its shutters closed for good. Within the week, Jessup would sell. Thibodeau would return to his presses, but never again to influence, his editorials growing sour, then thin. Judge Théo would resign and drift west, dying 2 years later with a glass in his hand. Sheriff Darrow would lose his next election to a coalition that had found its courage in a night of hymns. The night's chapter, once the parish's spine, splintered and sagged. Men who had walked like owners of the air began looking over shoulders they had never turned before. The confession did not enter a courtroom. It lived in a church trunk under a quilt, in a deacon's memory, in a copy hidden beneath floorboards, a sword on a string above 4 lives. And in kitchens and fields and schoolrooms, the story traveled faster than papers could print: a widow with a false name, a daughter with a true one, a ledger balanced when the law refused to count. Some called it vengeance. Some called it blasphemy. In the quarters they called it something else: a debt recorded, so that when grandchildren asked how the terror ended, the answer wouldn't be, "It stopped," but, "We made them write it down." They did not hang a man for what was written that night. No jury filed in, no foreman rose, no gavel fell, yet the parish changed as if a verdict had been read. Judge Teot resigned and drifted west, dying 2 years later with a bottle for company. Sheriff Darrow lost his badge to a coalition that had learned in one night of hymns how to vote past fear. Jessup sold the hotel with its thin doors and left the state. Thibodeau kept printing, but his words shed weight. First influence, then confidence, then audience. The Knights of the White Camellia in St. Martin did not shatter in a single blow. They warped, splintered, and sagged until men stopped leaning on them. The confession never saw a courtroom. It lived where law rarely looked, under quilts in a church trunk, in a copy hidden beneath a floorboard, in the exact memory of a deacon who could recite its names without blinking. 4 lives moved under it like cattle beneath a storm line, flinching at thunder even when the rain held back. As for Josephine Boudreau, she did what she promised. She left Louisiana. The trail that had been so precise turned intentionally ragged. Mexico, said one rumor. Canada, said another. France, said a third, because people liked the echo of the accent she'd borrowed. The truth was plainer. She went north, took another name, and worked in small rooms with big intentions, reading letters for men who could not, finding lawyers who would, steering families through the bureaucracies that had learned how to snarl at freed souls. She did not tell her story. She did not sell it. In 1903, at 47, she died in New York and was laid in an unmarked plot where grass did the remembering. In the bayous, the story did its own living. It thinned and thickened as stories do. Details shifted their coats. One generation's whisper became the next generation's warning. Historians later argued at safe distances, was there a Celeste Dufresne at all? Were the 11 deaths the work of one hand or many? Official records called the killer unknown, and the signed confession stayed hidden long enough to become a rumor with bones. But absence of paper is not absence of truth. In a time when violence was tidied out of ledgers and shame was written off as policy, the tale of Lavenois held what the law could not. That power is not a spell. That patience can be a weapon. That memory, kept together by hymns and hands, can corner men who think corners are for other people. Sometimes, late, a grandmother's voice still leans close to a child's ear. There are debts that courts won't count, crimes that dockets won't name. When that happens, you do not ask the river to run backward. You learn where the quiet doors are. You gather your people. You make them write it down. 7 men went to ground in 1872. 4 lived on under a paper sky. And somewhere beyond the ledgers and the lantern light, a woman who had worn more than one name laid her head down knowing that balance, imperfect, bloody and outside the law, had been set, and that what remained would be remembered.